Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. I am Jeffrey Tan Shijiet, 261614. Today, we I2YJ is presenting the environment and development. Do you know that more than half of the economically active population in the developing world are relying on environment via agriculture, such as hunting, fishing, etc. This shows us the importance of the 7 Millennium Development Goal (MDG), which is to ensure environmental sustainability. So in this topic, we will examine the causes precisely from economic perspective and the consequences towards environmental, as well as suggesting a few potential solutions that can be used. A, de- a development path is sustainable if and only if the stock of overall capital asset remain constant or rise over the time being. To do so, the development policymaker incorporate some form of environment accounting into their decision. For example, the preservation or loss of valuable environmental resources should be factored into estimates of economic growth and human being, or by setting a goal of no net loss of environmental asset. The formula to measure sustainable net national income, aka NNI star, is NNI star equals to GNI minus DM minus DN, where GNI is gross national income, DN is net depreciation of environmental capital, and DN is depreciation of manufactured capital asset. To have a more accurate measurement, we may use NNI star equals to GNI minus DM minus DN minus R minus A, where R is expenditure required to restore environmental capital, A is expenditure to avert destruction of environmental capital. Hence, it is important for the policymaker to understand sustainability and evaluation whether the path they are taking is sustainable or not. While many environment issues are believed that it was due to the population may reach the limit where their needs can still be met by the Earth's finite resources. However, it's clear that continuing on our existing path will compromise the ability to fulfill the future generations' needs. Rapid growing population have led to land, water, and fuel work shortage in rural areas and to urban health crisis due to lack of sanitation and clean water. However, if increasing in GNI and food production are slower than the population growth, per capita level of population and food self-sufficiency will fall. As a result, persistency in poverty would be likely to perpetual high fertility rate, aka the poor, will often depend on large families to survive. Note that the poor are often the main victim of environmental degradation. Why? This is because they often live on degraded land that are less expensive since the rich are avoiding them. But again, high fertility is blamed to cause poverty itself. This shows us that environmental destruction and high fertility are highly connected, which means they both are directly cause the absolute poverty. Hence, preventing environmental degradation should include the provision of institutional support to the poor rather than fighting an inevitable process of decay. So, is it possible for Earth to achieve growth without damaging our environment? As the income and consumption level in the economy increase, there will likely to have a net increase in environmental destruction. Kuznets believed that as per capita income increase, pollution and other form of environmental degradation will first rise and then fall in an inverted U pattern. This theory is called as the environmental Kuznets curve. According to this theory, society will have both means and willingness to pay for the environmental protection. However, there is no convincing evidence that some environmental damage, such as losing of biodiversity or irreversible damage, could be saved. Hence, active international policy is needed precisely on green growth. Next, My partner will be presenting about the rural development and the environment. Thank you.
Assalamualaikum, my name is Yusyabela binti Yuda Sudirman, matrix number 264344. I will present the rural development and the environment. This development objective is to reduce poverty and to protect the ecosystem. To meet the expanded food needs of rapidly growing population, food production in developing countries have to increase at least 50% in the next 3 decades. Radical changes are required in the distribution, use and quantity of resources available to the agriculture sector because land is being unsustainably overexploited by existing population. To reduce the dependence on unsustainable methods of production, poverty alleviation efforts must target women's economic status in particular because women are frequently the caretaker of rural resources and provide much of the agriculture supply of labor. The increased accessibility of agriculture inputs to small farmers and the introduction of sustainable methods of farming will help create attractive alternatives to current environmentally destructive patterns of resource use. Land augmenting investment can greatly increase the yields of cultivated land and help ensure future food self-sufficiency. Next is urban development and environment. Few governments are prepared to cope with the vastly increased strain on existing urban water supplies and sanitation facilities. Extreme health hazards are the result of environmental ills for the growing numbers of people exposed to them. These conditions threaten to precipitate the collapse of the existing urban infrastructure and create circumstances for epidemics and national health crises. It getting worsened by the fact that under existing legislation, more urban housing is illegal. This makes private household investment risky and renders large portion of urban population ineligible for government services. Next, let's see the causes that inflate the tremendously high environmental costs of urban crowding. First is congestion. Second is vehicular and industrial emission. Third is poorly ventilated household stoves. Next is the cost associated with poor urban conditions. First is lost productivity of ill or diseased workers. Second is the contamination of existing water source. And lastly, destruction of infrastructure. Urban environment worsen at a faster rate than urban population size increases, where the marginal environmental cost of additional resident rises over time. However, for a given income, the carbon footprint of a city resident tends to be lower than a suburban or rural resident. Next is the global environment and economy. As total world population grows and income rises, net global environmental degradation is likely to worsen. By using resources more efficiently, a number of environmental changes will actually provide economic savings and reduce negative impacts on the environment. However, doing many essential changes will require substantial investment in pollution abatement, technology, and resource management. Thus, the poorer the country, the more difficult it will to absorb environmental improvement costs. In the absence of substantial assistance to low-income countries, environmental effort will necessarily have to be funded at the expense of other social programs such as education, health services, and employment schemes that themselves have important implications for the preservation of the global environment. Developed world has caused environmental destructive, but with high fertility rates, rising average incomes, and increasing greenhouse gas emission, it can improve the global environment. Next is the natural resource-based livelihood as a pathway out of poverty, promise, and limitation. Environmental income such as agriculture, hunting, fishing, or forestry, along with foraging and other activities, is vitally important to a majority of the poor, and under the right policy condition, however, access to the benefits of environmental resources is often highly inequitable, can offer a pathway out of poverty. The poor have been losing control of some of their traditional natural resource commons, including forests, fields, and fishing area, to private property rights arrangement or to corrupt public land management. Many of the rural poor lacking access to adequate farmland or to resources for earning adequate livelihoods from nature. In developing countries, much natural resource exploitation has been locally unsustainable and has occurred in a manner on a scale that often bypasses the poor. Lastly, the scope of domestic origin environment degradation. Health and productivity problem is the consequence of environmental damage include water pollution and scarcity, air pollution, deforestation, loss of biodiversity and global warming which cause climate change. The growing intensification of cultivation of fragile lands lead to rapid soil degradation and loss of productivity. Prevalence of unsanitary conditions created by lack of clean water and sanitation is the environmental problem shared by both the urban and the rural, where it contributes greatly to the spread of infectious disease. Airborne pollutants also take a high toll on the health of citizens in developing countries. Dependence of biomass fuels, which can lead to indoor pollution, is closely related to poverty. Biomass fuels is any combustion organic matter that may be used as fuels such as firewood and agriculture residue. That's all from me. I will pass to the next presenter.
My name is Nurul Jannah binti Ab Manaf, metric number 262508, and I will be presenting about the global warming and climate change, scope, mitigation and adaptation. Scope of the problem. In 2007, the Intergovernmental Panel of Climate Change, IPCC, released its fourth assessment report. It concluded that the developing world, especially the poorest countries, may face major consequences from global warming that involves larger and more severe heat waves, hurricanes, floods from heavy rains, prolonged droughts, losses of valuable species, crop and fishing losses. Global warming is likely to present an unprecedented environmental challenge for the developing world. The 2006 Review on the Economics of Climate Change concluded that the poorest developing countries will be hit earliest and hardest by climate change, even though they have contributed little to causing the problem. It is difficult to finance adaptation due to their low incomes. The international community has an obligation to support them in adapting to climate change. Without such support, the development progress may be undermined. The review also concluded that food production in the tropics would be harmed. The greater the degree of warming, the larger the predicted global agricultural and water impact. But generally, the review found that effective remediation is surprisingly affordable if decisive action is taken soon. Mitigation. Many strategies have been proposed for mitigation of emissions, including the development of carbon markets, taxes on carbon and subsidies to encourage faster technological progress. For regulation, given uncertainties in both benefits and costs of emissions reductions, there are difficult economic questions in devising the most efficient permit or emissions tax regimes. As a policy strategy, the Stern Review suggests establishing a long-term quantity cap on greenhouse gases in the atmosphere to guard against environmental catastrophe. This will involve long-term limits on the amount of greenhouse emissions equal to a quantity that the Earth can absorb. In the short term, policies could be designed to limit the economic burden if abatement costs turn out initially to be unexpectedly high. Adaptation. A significant amount of climate change is now essentially inevitable. Thus, adaptation to climate change in developing countries is critical for protecting livelihoods and continuing to make development gains. The UNDP has defined climate change adaptation as a process by which strategies to moderate, cope with, and take advantage of the consequence of climatic events are enhanced, developed, and implemented. Adaptation takes place in two forms: planned or policy adaptation undertaken by governments and autonomous or private adaptation undertaken directly by households, farms, and firms in response to climate change they experience or anticipate. Autonomous adaptation increases the marginal benefit of planned adaptation and vice versa. They are considered complements. But if autonomous adaptation reduces the need for planned adaptation and vice versa, then they are substitutes. As suggested by Arun Agrawal and Nicholas Perrin, depending on how risks are reduced or avoided, 5 classes of adaptation strategies can be identified. In addition to the long-term trends caused by global warming, climate also fluctuates and changes for other reasons, and rural people in developing countries naturally take steps to adapt.
Thank you, Jana. My name is Yee Chin Chuan, nometric 261511, and today I would like to talk about the economic models of environmental issue. So, let's start with the privately owned resources. We will apply to environmental issue to determine what conditions are necessary for the efficient allocation of resources and how market failure lead to inefficiencies. The proponent of neoclassical free market theory stressed that the inefficiencies in the allocation of resources result from intermittent to the operation of the free market and the imperfection in the property rights system. So as long as all resources are privately owned and there is no market distortion, resources will be allocated efficiently. The perfect property right market are characterized by 4 conditions, which is the first one, universality, where all resources are privately owned. Second will be the exclusivity or excludability, where it must be possible to prevent others from benefit from a privately owned resources. And third will be transferability, where the owner of the resources may sell the resources when desired. And last will be the enforceability, where the intended market distribution of the benefit from resources must be enforceable. Now we're going to look how the market determines the optimal consumption of the natural resource using this figure. Finding the optimal market outcome involves maximizing the total net benefit to the society from a resource, which is the difference between the total benefit derived from a resource and the total cost to producer of providing it. This is equal to the 2 shaded area in this figure. The total net benefit is maximized when the marginal cost of extracting 1 more unit of the resources is equal to its marginal benefit to the consumer. This occurs at Q star, where the demand and supply curve intersect. In the perfectly competitive market, the invisible hand will ensure that the Q star is the quantity produced. The marginal cost curve in this figure is upward sloping because the extraction costs increase as the resources become more scarce. The resulting producer surplus is area APB and the consumer surplus is the area DPB. Together they yield the maximum net benefit equal to DAB. If resources are scarce and are rationed over time, scarcity rent may arise. This may obtain even when the marginal cost of production is constant. In this figure, the owner of scarce resource has a finite volume of resources X to sell, which is 75 units, and know that by saving a portion of it for future sale, he or she can charge a higher price today. The price of the good that being rationed over time must be equate to the present value of the marginal net benefit of the last unit consumed in each period. That is, the consumer must be indifferent between obtaining the next unit today and obtaining it tomorrow. In this figure, assume that there is a resource owner has 75 units available. If he or she willing to offer only 50 units for sale today, the market price for the scarce resource is PS. The scarcity rent collected by the owner of the resource is equal to PS A BP, the shaded region in the diagram between the price and the marginal cost. It is the owner's ability to collect this rent that create the rationing effect to ensure the efficient allocation of the resource over time. In the absence of scarcity, all the resources will be sold at the extraction cost P equal to MC, 75 unit, and will be consumed at one time, and no rent will be collected. Now let's move on to the common property resources, where the resources is publicly owned and allocated under a system of unrestricted access. Any potential of profit or scarcity rent will be competed away if the scarce resource is publicly owned and available to all. The neoclassical theory suggests that in the absence of the scarcity rents, efficiencies will arise. Using a somewhat different framework, we will investigate the misallocation of the resources under a common property system. This figure describes the relationship between the value per unit of labor on a given piece of land and the number of laborers cultivating it. The landowner will hire additional labor to work the land until the marginal product of the last worker is equal to the market wage, W at a point L star, where MPL equal to W. The workload is shared equally among the employees, each of whom produce the average product. However, assuming the decreasing return to labor, each new worker hired reduces the average product of all workers. The marginal product of each additional worker is thus equal to his average product minus the decrease in the average product across all the workers. If an additional employee is hired beyond L star, the cost to the producer, W, will be greater than his marginal product, and the difference will be represented to a net loss to the landowner. The profit maximizer thus will only hire L star worker with a total output equal to the average product AP star multiplied by the number of the worker L star. The scarcity of rent collected by the landowner will be equal to AP star, C, D, and W.
Assalamualaikum and salam sejahtera. My name is Nur Izzati binti Izharuddin and my magic number is 261497. Our next part in this chapter is a public good and bad, regional environmental degradation and the free rider problem. In the preceding discussion, the core economic problem was that each additional workers who joined those cultivating commonly held land create a negative externality by lowering the return to all other workers without providing any compensation. An externality occurs when one person's consumption or production behavior affects that of another without any compensation. In many cases, the internalization of externalities is not so easily accomplished. This is especially the case where the consequence of an individual actions constitute a public good or a public bad. What is a public good and public bad? A public good is anything that provides a benefit to everyone and the availability of which is in no way diminished by its simultaneous enjoyment by others. For example, clean air, economic institutions, and national defense. A public bad is any product or condition that decreases the well-being of others in a non-exhaustive manner. For example, like water pollution and air pollution. To simplify our analysis, we will translate the public bad problem into a public good framework. Okay, let's see in the figure 10.4a in this slide. The most obvious difference between a public good and purely private good is that aggregate demand for the public resource is determined by summing individual demand curve vertically as in the figure 10.4a. At Q star, total net benefit to society from the public good PMDC are maximized. However, due to what we call the free rider problem, the free market will not lead to this optimal quantity. At a price of PM, the free market will satisfy present B demand QB while not denying present A requirements of QA. That is it, A can free ride on P contribution. The market will therefore provide a suboptimal level of forest preservation QB. To restore optimality, some form of government intervention is required. The most efficient solution is to charge each consumer just enough per unit, PA and PB for individual A and B, respectively, to entice each of them to demand the preservation of the optimal quantity of trees Q star. Our last part in this chapter is a limitation of the public good framework. People have no incentive to divulge how much they really benefit from a public good because by shrinking they may be very right on the contribution of others and avoid paying their full share. Hypothetically, collected fees can be used to provide a public good when the collection of fees entails taxing deeply impoverished population with little or no cash income. Such a problem becomes an impossibility. However, new classical theory can be useful for explaining why market failure lead to the efficient allocation of resource in highly commercialized economy and how this efficient may be mitigated. That's all from my group, I2IJ. Thank you.